papal princess, 3 weddings in a single night, and a humiliation so grotesque it echoed through centuries. On June 13, 1497, the bells of Rome rang out in celebration, but behind the gilded doors of the Vatican, a 17-year-old girl was about to endure one of the most disturbing nights in papal history. Her name was Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, a young woman raised not for love, not for freedom, but as a weapon in her father's endless game for power. That night, in a spectacle that blurred the line between the sacred and the obscene, she would be forced to marry the same man not once, not twice, but 3 times, each ceremony stripping away another piece of her dignity. What unfolded was more than a wedding. It was a performance, a shocking display of corruption that revealed just how far the Borgias were willing to go to control both politics and the church. And at the centre of it all stood Lucrezia, both pawn and victim in one of history's darkest family dramas. To understand Lucrezia's fate, you first need to understand the world she was born into. A world where the Vatican wasn't just a holy seat of faith, but the most dangerous political stage in Europe. Rodrigo Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI, didn't climb to power through holiness. He bought it. He bribed, threatened and manipulated his way into the papacy in 1492, transforming the church into little more than his personal empire. Once crowned, he treated Rome as if it were his family estate. Sacred offices were sold like merchandise, and the papal treasury became his private bank. But the most valuable investments weren't coins or crowns, they were his children. Among them was Lucrezia, born in 1480, the daughter of Rodrigo and his mistress, Vanosa de Catanei. From the moment she could walk, she wasn't treated as a beloved child, but as currency in her father's game. Every lesson she received, languages, music, dance, the art of charm, was carefully chosen to increase her worth on the marriage market. By the time she was 11, she was already promised to a Spanish noble. 2 years later, she was promised again to a Neapolitan lord. Each engagement collapsed the moment politics shifted. For Lucrezia, these weren't heartbreaks, they were lessons. Lessons that she wasn't a person in her father's eyes, but a bargaining chip. Her future would be negotiated in back rooms and sealed at altars, with her voice little more than a formality. But her real story, and her real suffering, began with her first official marriage, a union that would end in public humiliation and set the stage for the infamous night of 3 weddings. In 1493, at just 13 years old, Lucrezia was married off to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. The alliance was strategic, strengthening ties between the powerful Sforza family and the Pope. The ceremony was held inside the Apostolic Palace itself, with none other than Alexander VI, her father, presiding over his daughter's marriage as though it were a political contract. But the humiliation didn't end with vows. As was the twisted custom of the time, the consummation of the marriage had to be publicly confirmed. For a terrified 13-year-old girl, this meant her most private moment was staged for witnesses, a cruel performance meant to guarantee that the union could never be annulled. For 4 years, Lucrezia lived as Giovanni's wife, but even this fragile stability wasn't hers to keep. Politics shifted, alliances broke, and suddenly the Sforzas were no longer useful to the Borgia machine. Alexander VI decided the marriage had to go, and so he demanded an annulment. The official reason? That the marriage had never been consummated. A brazen lie, considering it had been made painfully public years before. Giovanni Sforza resisted at first, furious at the insult, but the Borgias didn't take no lightly. Threats mounted, whispers of mortal danger grew louder, and eventually Giovanni surrendered. For Lucrezia, it was another brutal lesson. Her body, her vows, even her humiliation, none of it mattered. Her life wasn't hers to control. It belonged entirely to her father's ambition. And as she prepared for her second marriage, she had no idea that the next ceremony would go down in history as one of the most perverse spectacles the Vatican had ever staged. June 13th, 1497. Rome celebrated with bells and processions, but inside the Vatican, the stage was being set for something darker. Lucrezia Borgia, now 17, was preparing for her second marriage. This time to Alfonso of Aragon, a young duke chosen not for love, but because he offered her father a stronger political tie to Naples. But Pope Alexander VI wasn't interested in a simple wedding. He wanted absolute certainty that this marriage could never be questioned, never annulled, and never undone. His solution? a grotesque spectacle unlike anything seen before. 3 separate wedding ceremonies in a single night. The first took place in the Sistine Chapel, with the Pope himself officiating. Surrounded by cardinals and nobles, Lucrezia stood trembling in a white silk gown embroidered with gold. Her hands shook as her father spoke sacred vows with a casual arrogance, treating the words of the church like a family transaction. Alfonso, barely older than her, looked just as uneasy, swallowed by the weight of this performance. No sooner had the vows been exchanged than the entire procession moved to the Pope's private chambers. Here, a second ceremony began, this time in archaic Latin, a deliberate choice meant to give the marriage greater weight in canon law. Lucrezia's voice faltered as she repeated her vows, growing weaker with each word, as though the life was being drained from her with every repetition. But the ordeal wasn't over. Before dawn, they climbed to the highest tower of Castel Sant'Angelo, the Pal fortress looming over Rome. A third priest, fiercely loyal to the Borgias, was brought in to preside. This time the vows had been rewritten to include clauses about the union's indissolubility, ensuring there would be no escape. Here, under the cold morning sky, Lucrezia finally broke. Witnesses later claimed she wept uncontrollably, not from joy, but from despair. Alfonso tried to comfort her, but even that was interrupted. The Pope scolded him, declaring that tears had no place on such a glorious night, and so, through sobs and broken whispers, Lucrezia was forced to finish her vows. By sunrise, she was married 3 times to the same man, not out of love, not out of faith, but out of her father's obsession with power and his determination to turn a sacred sacrament into a weapon. But the nightmare didn't end with the ceremonies. What came next was even more disturbing. If 3 ceremonies in one night weren't disturbing enough, Pope Alexander VI took his obsession even further. He ordered that each wedding be followed by its own act of consummation, 3 separate times, in 3 separate chambers, all meticulously documented. For Lucrezia, this meant her dignity was not only stripped once, but violated again and again. And worse, none of it was private. Cardinals, ambassadors, and nobles were required to act as witnesses, standing by to confirm that the union had been sealed. What should have been an intimate moment between husband and wife was transformed into a cold, public ritual, a grotesque performance designed to remove any possibility of doubt. The Pope made sure of it. Every detail was recorded, the exact hour of each act, the names of the witnesses, even descriptions of the garments Lucrezia wore. This wasn't love. This wasn't faith, it was bureaucracy, the humiliation of a young woman turned into paperwork, filed and sealed in the Vatican's secret archives. For the Borgias, this was strategy. For Lucrezia, it was torment. Each repetition drove home the same cruel message. Her body, her vows, her very life existed only to serve her father's ambition. And while the Pope believed he had built a fortress around this marriage, what he had really built was outrage. Across Europe, the reaction was swift and merciless. Word of the triple wedding and its grotesque consummation spread across Europe like wildfire. Ambassadors stationed in Rome sent frantic reports back to their courts, each letter dripping with shock and disgust. The French ambassador described the night as a blasphemous circus. The representative of the Holy Roman Empire warned his emperor that the papacy had reached a new depth of depravity. Even Spain, the Pope's own homeland, reacted with horror at what their countrymen had turned the Vatican into. The Doge of Venice, in a private letter, was even more brutal. He sneered that the Pope had turned his daughter into a sacred prostitute, marrying her again and again as if the sacraments were toys for his amusement. Inside Rome, the reaction was more complicated. The citizens were already numb to Borgia corruption, but even they whispered in disbelief. Anonymous pamphlets circulated through the city, mocking Lucrezia as the most married woman in Christendom and denouncing her father as nothing less than the Antichrist on St. Peter's throne. For many, this night was more than scandal. It was proof. Proof that the papacy was no longer a spiritual authority, but a family business corrupted to its very core. And as criticism mounted, the Borgias clung even tighter to their power, silencing dissent where they could. But amidst all this noise and outrage, something unexpected happened. For the first time in her life, Lucrezia found a glimpse of real happiness, because against all odds, she and Alfonso of Aragon began to fall for each other. For a short time, it seemed as if Lucrezia's nightmare might soften into something resembling peace. Despite the grotesque circumstances of their union, Alfonso of Aragon began to show her genuine affection. Unlike her father and brothers, he treated her not as a bargaining chip, but as a person. Slowly, Lucrezia's guard began to drop. After years of being passed around as currency, she found in Alfonso something she had never known before: kindness, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to believe in happiness. But happiness, in the Borgia world, was always temporary. By 1500, Pope Alexander VI's political priorities had shifted once again. An alliance with France offered more power than the ties to Naples that Alfonso represented. That made him expendable. The solution was brutal, and it came at the hands of Lucrezia's own brother, Cesare Borgia. One night, Alfonso was attacked in the streets of Rome by Cesare's men. Stabbed and left for dead, he struggled to recover under Lucrezia's care. For weeks she nursed him, desperate to save the man who had finally given her a glimpse of life beyond politics. But Cesare wasn't finished. Months later, Alfonso was strangled in his bed, murdered under orders that were quietly covered up by papal authorities. The message to Lucrezia was cruelly clear. No one she loved would ever be safe if it threatened her family's ambitions. The loss devastated her. Alfonso had been her only source of comfort, her only chance at a life of her own, and now he was gone, ripped from her by the same family that claimed to protect her. For the first time, Lucrezia tried to resist. She begged to escape, even asking permission to retreat into a convent. But resistance was dangerous when your father was the Pope and your brother a warlord, and the Borgias were not about to release their most valuable pawn. After Alfonso's death, Lucrezia was broken. The brief taste of love and freedom had only. He made her captivity feel sharper. She pleaded with her father to let her leave Rome, even offering to live the rest of her life behind convent walls. But Alexander VI refused. A daughter of the Pope could not disappear into obscurity, not when her beauty and name were still powerful weapons in his political arsenal. Her resistance only fueled the family's determination. Cesare had ambitions stretching across Italy, and Lucrezia's hand in marriage was once again the bargaining chip to secure them. This time, the target was the Este family of Ferrara, one of the most prestigious dynasties in northern Italy. The Este court was not thrilled. They knew the reputation that followed the Borgia name: whispers of poisonings, affairs, and the scandal of Lucrezia's past marriages. Many at court openly mocked the idea of taking her in. But politics won over pride, and in 1502, negotiations were sealed. Lucrezia was married off once more, this time to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. For the Borgias, it was another triumph, securing an alliance that gave them influence far beyond Rome. For Lucrezia, it was yet another chain tightening around her life. But Ferrara would not be like Rome. The court she entered was cold, suspicious, and filled with enemies who resented her very presence. And yet, it was here that Lucrezia would finally begin to reshape her destiny, not as a pawn, but as something far more dangerous. In Ferrara, Lucrezia's story took a surprising turn. At first, she was dismissed as little more than the scandalous daughter of a corrupt pope, but slowly, she began to transform her image. Instead of fighting her reputation directly, she built a new one. She became a skilled political mediator, a respected duchess, and even a patron of the arts. Poets and scholars were drawn to her court, and for the first time she carved out an identity not defined entirely by her family. Yet even in Ferrara, shadows followed her. Tragedy haunted her pregnancies. Many ended in heartbreak, and several of her children did not survive. The weight of loss never left her. Still, she endured, and those who knew her spoke of a woman whose strength was far greater than the scandals that clung to her name. By the time of her death in 1519, at just 39 years old, Lucrezia Borgia was no longer the terrified girl paraded through Rome. She had become something much more complex, both a victim of her family's ruthless ambitions and a survivor who learned to wield power in her own right. Her legacy remains tangled in myth and rumour. For centuries she was painted as a femme fatale, a poisoner, an accomplice to her father's sins, a seductress who thrived in corruption. But the truth is harder to pin down. Was she the monster her enemies described, or was she a young woman trapped in a world that used her as a pawn, forced to carry the blame for the crimes of men far more powerful than herself? What we do know is this: Lucrezia Borgia's life exposes the darkest contradictions of Renaissance Italy, a world of dazzling beauty and brutal cruelty, where even the daughter of the Pope was never truly free. And centuries later, her name still carries the same mixture of fascination and fear, a symbol of power, scandal and survival that refuses to be forgotten. Lucrezia Borgia's life is a reminder that history is never black and white. She was born into power, yet stripped of choice. Used as a pawn, yet remembered as a legend. Some saw her as a villain, others as a victim, but the truth is far more complicated. She was all of these things, and more. What makes her story endure isn't just the scandals or the whispered rumours of poison and betrayal, it's the way she survived them. In a world where women were rarely allowed a voice, Lucrezia managed to shape her own, carving out a legacy that still fascinates us half a millennium later. And maybe that's why we keep returning to her story, because behind the myths, the rumours and the propaganda lies a young woman who was forced to navigate one of history's most dangerous families and somehow left a mark that time could not erase. So what do you think? Was Lucrezia Borgia the ruthless conspirator her enemies painted her to be, or the tragic survivor of a family that used her as a weapon? Drop your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear your take. And if you want more untold stories from history's darkest corner, make sure to like this video and subscribe for the next one. Because as Lucrezia's story shows, the past is never truly gone. It's still shaping the world we live in today.